Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to this webinar on the topic of reasons why your big data cloud migration fails and ways to overcome. My name is Kwok and I'll be your host today. I'm joined by our fantastic data lover here, Chris Santiago, who is our Solutions Engineering Director, who will be sharing some interesting insights on moving big data to the cloud and some of the pitfalls and challenges that organizations are facing. Hello, Chris. How are you?
Good. How about yourself?
Yeah, fantastic. It's 6 p.m. here in London. I believe you are in the windy city of Chicago.
I am.
How's the weather there right now?
It's getting windy. Shocking.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, so before we start, here's some quick housekeeping rules. So if you do have any questions, feel free to type them into the question box, type in your question, and we'll answer them live. Or if you're watching on demand, we'll answer them by email reply. This webinar is available instantly on demand. So if you do have to drop off, feel free to come back to this page and listen at your leisure. Let us know what you think about this session by rating this webinar. Let us know if there's any other topics you'd like to hear about, or if there's any areas that we've missed, just give us a shout. And now I will hand over to Chris, who will then take it from here.
Awesome. Thanks, Kwok. Just a really quick check. Can you see my presentation okay there, Kwok?
I can.
All right. Hey, folks. So just to reiterate, why we're here is to really talk about reasons why your big data cloud migration fails. And hey, there's some good news here. There's some ways to overcome that. Kwok did an excellent job introducing me, but I can give you guys a bit of a background from me. So been with the company for 2.5 years now. Unravel as a tool has been very, very good for really leading customers throughout their big data journey, whether it be on-premise, on the cloud, in transition, or maybe a hybrid type of environment. The last 1.5 years, I've really been helping customers on this cloud migration front. If you guys are on the call right now, you probably have the same interest that most other customers do. And with the advent of the cloud, with all the nice features that cloud brings to you, how can I take advantage of that? And in fact, customers, lots of customers have taken that plunge. And unfortunate as it is, sometimes those cloud migration initiatives don't pan out like they had anticipated, or even worse yet, going back to the original architecture that they had brought in. And so what I want to do is throughout the years of here at Unravel and really focusing in on that cloud migration play, let me show you we're going to discuss some things that I've noticed that, like, hey, if you have these traits, you may want to think of a better approach. And because ultimately this will make your big data projects fail. And so I always like starting off with some stats, but interesting stats here from Unisys Corporation. 37% of cloud migrations have failed to date. And this is interviewing 1,000 companies across 13 countries. If we go with a more familiar source like a Gartner, 45% of organizations that perform, a lift and shift, right, to cloud IaaS will be provisioned by as much as 55% and overspend 70% during the first 18 months. I mean, that's when you're talking large organizations, we're talking millions of dollars here, right? And with all this said, these are some of the reasons why cloud migrations fail, right? And so why do they fail? The first section here that we'll be talking about here is really just starting from the scratch. And like when you're planning for your migration, if you don't have a good foundation, whether that be coming up with a total cost of ownership of the migration, whether it be setting the right architecture, what have you, that's ultimately going to lead to failure when you're going through your implementation plan. And so, one of the big things that we see a lot of customers do is really miss the complexity of their workloads on their current environment. Now, as you can imagine, today, if you are running on-prem, I think it's safe to say probably Hadoop, probably using one of like the distributed platforms like your Cloudera, like your Hortonworks. And so, when you start thinking about moving, workloads to the cloud, you do have the ability to lift and shift if you want. We'll touch that shortly, but a lot of folks, they really want to start kind of sectioning things off and moving towards a more modern data architecture where they're using many services that are specifically used for their particular workload. The challenge here is that today, most some of the cloud vendors out there, some of the the SIs, the system integrators that are in this space today, it is a manual approach. It's like talking with folks, trying to understand the workloads, trying to get like the relationships of the types of systems that they're using, et cetera, and so forth. And you got to get this right? Because if you miss on, hey, my particular workload typically uses 10 terabytes of data, but it ends up actually being petabytes of data. You're going to pay for that in the cloud. Same thing that goes with like compute memory resources. Like, hey, how heavy of a intensive a workload is this, right? The worst thing you want to do is over allocate resources. From a logic perspective, when you're looking at your SQL queries, when you're looking at your code, hey, is this actually going to fit, with whatever the future architecture may be? And so what happens is, a lot of folks will, do the initial conversations, very manual. And it's only when they're 70% of the way of the migration and they're 90% of the way that they realize, oh my gosh, I missed this particular table. It's got some complexity in there, et cetera, and so forth. And so, that not only adds cost, but that also adds issues to the timeline itself. And so the second piece here is just really just delay to the migration timeline. I've worked with customers where they've had timelines of getting this, finishing up and wrapping up their migration efforts within a matter of months. But like generally what I'm saying, the larger the organization, these migration efforts, we're talking, multi-year here, right? Depending on, the complexity, depending on the size of your organization here. And so, a lot of folks want to go and move to the cloud as soon as possible, but hey, you got to keep the lights on, right? So whatever system that you're running today, that needs to continuously run, and you still need to do your tests, et cetera, and so forth. And so, a lot of times, once this starts getting, the migration timelines start, adding up to a year, 6 months, whatever it may be, a lot of folks end up being like, hey, this is just not even worth it. My current architecture that I'm using today is, meeting my needs. We'll either defer this or not even move to the cloud to begin with. So just understanding and understanding like how long it's going to take this and not actually have a good plan can really help, can really exacerbate, the delays to your timeline and ultimately lead to a poor to failed cloud migration. And last but not least, I think this all goes down to, you're doing something manually, you don't have visibility into how long things are going to take. At the end of the day, you just don't have the data points, right? And so like when you are using hope as a reason for the for your cloud migrations to be successful in the cloud, that's not a good approach, right? And so me coming in from a data background, whatever data points that you can get to really kind of guide your approach is really going to be the best, is going to be what's going to set you up for success. And for folks where they didn't really do their due diligence, they didn't really get down, get their hands dirty and really understand complexity of the existing workloads and how that maps to the cloud itself, it really is doomed for failure. So poor migration planning, just making sure that you have a good plan in terms of, knowing your total cost of ownership, knowing exactly what needs to be migrated, what's the future architecture. If that stuff is squishy, things are looking bad for your cloud migration project. The second piece here is, hey, now that I'm moving into the cloud, I'm going to be using, maybe some of the services that are cloud native. Maybe I'm going to be using IaaS, to begin with. But a lot of times, people have this conception of, hey, if I move into the cloud, it's going to be faster, cheaper. There's this easy button. And while all that stuff is good and true, it's not moving to the cloud is going to answer all your problems, right? And so when I start looking at folks and I see like how they're, architecting whatever that future state may be, a lot of times people will have this idea of like, hey, well, I'm going to move my workloads how they are today as little as possible, lift and shift type of model. And we'll get into the cloud, and either I'm going to stay in the cloud and maybe do an IaaS, infrastructure as a service type of model, or I'll figure it out when I get to the cloud, you know. So, with that, having the ability to re-platform, re-architect your existing platform, but all you're doing is really like truly lifting and shifting everything, well, you're bringing in bad practices into your new architecture, and you're not really addressing it. And in fact, when you're in the cloud and you're using things such as like an IaaS architecture, believe it or not, that's more expensive than well, in general, that's more expensive than what you may be running, on-prem today, right? And so when I see that people are really just part and parcel moving things around and not really taking advantage of, some of the advantages that cloud takes, I can see, that particular migration project did not do so hot. This is another big piece is just, one of the biggest advantages of the cloud is, really separating this whole compute and store. Some of the challenges that customers had in their on-prem environment today is like, you don't really decouple compute and store. It's like you grow, regardless if you need, compute and or store, you grow, as appropriate, right? And so that really capped a lot of folks from an on-prem world, right? And so when you go into the cloud, and this is just one example, but like being able to separate that means you can infinitely grow your data, and you can bring the compute to where the data resides, having this whole scalable fashion, et cetera, and so forth. If you're not taking an advantage of those like cloud native features that are very very specific to the cloud, that you can take advantage of, well then this ends up being a very costly manner, and a lot of times customers get hit their budgets a lot sooner rather than later, and then they need to move back into their on-prem world. And so if you're not taking advantage of things such as like separation of compute and store and your new architecture, well, then you're not really taking advantage of some of the cost-conscious, cost-saving features in the cloud. And, that's a no-no. Multi-tenant architectures, if this is, if you heard me talk about this in the past, I think multi-tenant architecture from an on-prem standpoint made sense, because you had a sunk cost, very, very expensive infrastructure. And so you wanted to make sure you're maximizing that, to the most potential. And that made sense for the most part from an on-prem world. But one of the biggest challenges of a multi-tenant architecture, and what I mean by that is like having my finance group use the same system, my engineering group use the same system, so on and so forth. You run into issues of like resource contention, running out of resources. Somebody's, not playing nice and taking up all the resources for their jobs, and everybody else is queued up. And so, those are some of the disadvantages of a multi-tenant architecture. Now, in the new world in cloud, if you're not taking advantage of having the line of business with their own compute architecture, whether that be Databricks, HD Insight, EMR, they can go ahead and do whatever they want to do and not be affected by their tenants. That's going back into a single tenant purpose-built cluster for your tenants is something that, I see a lot of successful cloud customers do, and not so successful cloud customers where they're, again, bringing back that whole bad design practices into the cloud, is really going to hurt you in the long run. And then finally, application that don't take advantage of cloud native features. This really just sums everything up. What I was saying is that like you're moving to the cloud. If you really think that, just lift and shifting everything that you've done, on-prem, you're in for a rude awakening when you start looking at your, start looking at your bill. And so whatever you can do to take advantage of the cloud native features is something that you want to look forward to, or you want to take into account when you're planning whatever that future modern data architecture is going to be for your organization. Last but not least, realized ROI is not the promised ROI is not realized by the business. And this is a big one, because when you are going through your migrations of your workloads from on-prem into the cloud, probably the most important factor is, are you getting the performance that you were promised in this new architecture? Are you saving the costs that was promised in this new architecture? And a lot of folks go and they move things to the cloud and they don't take that into account. And so what that ends up being is like, poor user experience for the end users, ballooning costs, from a cost standpoint. And so, this is something where, hey, I made this investment and ran it for a couple of months, not getting anything that near than what I have, and then I moved back into my previous architecture. And that's what we want to avoid here, right? We want to make sure that you guys are taking advantage of, this new modern data architecture in the cloud. And so I've broken this up into two sections here. So cost, some things to keep in mind is, hey, in this new world, there's it's a new way of paying, right? You've got this pay-as-you-go model. And not only that, but some things that you may not have paid for previously, you're paying for in the cloud. One big one that always comes to mind is like ingress, egress costs. So think of that as the data that's coming in and leaving your system. And so, in an on-prem world, that stuff's a sunk cost. You're already paying for it, so you don't even think about that. But in the cloud world, that's a parameter that you get charged. And so if you have an application that is just poorly written and is just, massively, moving data around when it doesn't need to be, that's something that is really going to bite you if you don't have that into account. And so that's something, ingress egress costs is one thing. There's many things that that you see in the cloud. So like not understanding all the little pieces of things where you can get charged is something that can bite you in the long run. You need to take that into account. Pay as you go. It's a blessing and a curse, right? I was working with one customer just recently, and they had a good analogy. Like when you're an on-prem environment, you typically have a procurement boss or procurement person right there that negotiates the costs and really wants to make sure that obviously the company gets the cost that they want, but like you're not going to incur additional costs. So think of it as like a cap, right? Whatever the agreed upon is, then that's where you stand, right? In this subscription type of model in the cloud, that doesn't really fly, right? Now, granted, there are things that you can do to kind of like, make sure that you don't go over your budgets. But at the end of the day, this is a pay-as-you-go model. You're paying for resources, whether your applications fail, they're slow, whatever it is, right? And depending on your business function, you're going to have to pay for those resources to finally get it to the state that you need to be. And so in that, back to that my example with the on-prem world, it's you've got that procurement manager that's sitting there and saying like, hey, you can't go over X amount of dollars. That's negotiated, and then you're good to go. And this pay-as-you-go model, like there could be, I've seen developers submit like a query overnight thinking it was just a regular query, and it ended up being $20,000, $30,000 just for that particular query alone. I'm sure folks here on this webinar have experienced that. And so not being able to forecast what your cost may be in this pay-as-you-go model, can really hurt you from a cost perspective, and not really recognize the ROI that was promised by by the cloud vendors and or some of the SIs that assist customers to move to the cloud. And then last but not least, bad cloud usage behavior among the end users, right? So, is there somebody submitting, that $20,000 query, that $30,000 query, like consistently? Those are the types of things where it's like, now you actually need to rein in your users, make sure that they're having best practices with the applications that they submit, et cetera and so forth. So that way you can have a handle on that cost. But generally speaking, these are some of the three main things that I see where people get really burned in on the cost once they're actually in the cloud. They didn't validate, how this was going to work from an on-prem perspective, and this ends up actually making projects fail from a cost perspective. Now let's talk about performance. So I'm coming into this new modern data architecture. First and foremost, I'm thinking it should be at least same kind of SLAs that are going to be met, maybe even faster, right? But a lot of times that's not the case because in this cloud environment, you are talking shared infrastructure depending on the type of services that you use. So in an EMR world, for example, like if you ask for like an ephemeral cluster to get spun up, you might be waiting a few minutes for that, right? And so obviously that affects SLAs. From a data storage standpoint, right? Depending on how you do your hot, warm, and cold, that makes a difference. Like data locality, all that good stuff really takes into account the performance of your job. And a lot of times, especially for folks that are coming in here brand new, they don't realize these small nuances that, the assumptions that they made from an on-prem standpoint are the same assumptions that are in this new cloud world. No, that's not. It's different problems, different things you need to take into account. And, not taking that into account, being able to validate your performance from on-prem versus in your new architecture, obviously, is a cause for some users to go back to the old environment. Resource locality, we had mentioned that before. Now we're talking about geographical, instances where it can be advantageous if you need to have a geographical kind of coverage for your applications. But when you don't take that into account and you're having your services that are 1,000 miles away, 2,000 miles away, being hit by your users that are in your local area, that's obviously there's going to be performance implications from that standpoint. And finally, and last but not least, like this is the big one, like being able to, do an apples to apples comparison between what I had today versus what now. That does a couple of things. One, am I getting the ROI that was promised from, my cloud vendors or my SIs? And two, am I actually getting the cost savings that I've been promised in this, in this new world? And without having, the ability to match, apples to apples, a lot of the ROI is actually not realized for companies. And again, failed big data cloud migrations is something that we want to avoid. And so in general, there's a lot more that I can cover here, but those are some of the three big things that I've seen in my experience, working with customers, ranging from Fortune 500 down to, even customers that are more small mid-market, starting their journey in the cloud. For the folks that are migrating, these are my top 3 reasons for you guys where I've seen cloud migrations fail in my experience. Now, let's get positive here. So here's a quote from Gartner: "Data-driven approach for planning and migrating is critical to success." And so what if there was a tool out there that could actually help you throughout your whole entire migration process and do it in a data-driven way? And that tool is Unravel. And so in this cloud migration play, really what we're going to do here is really help you out in the 3 areas. Run just even from the get-go, making a case for the cloud. Say that you're evaluating, AWS, Azure, wherever you are, you haven't really made any commitments, but you're still kind of doing your due diligence. This is something where a tool like Unravel can help you, make that case for whatever that is: performance savings, cost savings. Being able to drive those type of insights from a tool is something that we can do. Once you actually start creating and you've decided on whatever your future state modern data architecture is, how can we make that from a 2 to 3 year project down to a couple of months? Well, the only way you're going to be able to do that is if you have as much data points to really guide you on what's going to be most efficient and what's the fastest. And generally, I see customers do this in a phased approach. Hey, what is phase 1? What is phase 2? What is phase 10? Being able to get very, very down metrics onto what's your best path for migration is something where we can help. And last but not least, maximizing that ROI for migration. So Unravel as a tool, application performance management tool, by our very nature, we're going to be looking for ways to optimize applications, whether that be on-prem, whether that even be in the cloud. But what that means to you is if I can run, the bulk of my applications with 30% resources, 40% resources, when you're in that pay-as-you-go model in the cloud, that obviously makes a huge impact on your costs when you're actually in the cloud. So not only are we helping you with what your current state is, but we can help forecast you and give you proactive recommendations based on AI algorithms that we have to really help drive down those resource savings and ultimately drive maximum ROI throughout your whole migration journey. The way we do this is a four-step approach. And so very similar to that previous slide here, being able to assess. So give you all the information just to understand, just like, hey, let's level set. Like, what are the services I'm running? What are the type of workloads that I'm running, et cetera, and so forth. Let's just give you that baseline. Once you have that baseline, let's start planning. So let's actually come up with like that future state total cost of ownership. Is this going to be a lift and shift for phase one? And then I'm going to go and maybe move towards a multi-tiered cloud native technology. But what is that going to cost me? What's the level of effort? What's my timeline, et cetera, and so forth. That's where we can help from that standpoint. Once you actually come up with that future state recommendation and you start doing the actual implementation, we can help you from that standpoint too. We don't move the data per se, but what we do is provide insights on, hey, what is the best plan for you to actually do the migration? If I move things, for example, like one particular table into the cloud, hey, what are the dependencies? What are the applications that are running on this? What's the resource that these particular instances are running? So that way, if I'm going to move this to, say, for example, like an Amazon EMR, I know exactly what instances to use, and I can already forecast what that cost is going to be. And so being able to really drive the actual implementation migration phase is something where we can, where we have help customers. And then finally, once you're in the cloud, or even before, being able to optimize your existing applications. That way you're being most efficient with your resources. Obviously that translates to cost. That also translates to making sure that the SLAs are met for your data pipeline jobs. This is the proven four-step process that we do implement with our customers and our SIs, so that way we can guarantee success in your cloud migration journey, whether it be simple or complex as it is. And so it wouldn't be a bright talk if I didn't actually show you the tech. And so I do have some examples here to show you. So what you see right now is the Unravel interface. And really what's, when we talked about that four-step process, is like assess was the first one, is really just kind of getting a lay of the land on, hey, what type of services am I running? I really need to have like a baseline of what's going on. And so because Unravel is monitoring everything from your cluster, we can look at things such as, hey, what's the type of services that you're using in your cluster? What are the type of VMs that you or even bare metal servers that you're using in your cluster itself? And so getting that level of information is useful. What's your disk size, your disk space from within, in your current environment? And so high level stuff that, gives you some good information. We can also look at things from an application-centric perspective. So like, what are the types of applications? So in my environment here, I've got a combination of MapReduce, Spark, Tez. Looks like there's a lot more MapReduce and Tez, not so much Spark. So maybe this is a batch environment, right? So I can start getting insights from that standpoint. So if it's going to be batch, maybe I can use, maybe like an EMR, or maybe if it's like Spark heavy, I could also use EMR, but I could also use Databricks. You start getting that, but you start getting these insights of like what that future, modern data architecture may be. And the only way to do that is to get, down to the nitty gritty of like the applications, the data, et cetera, and so forth. And so you get that from an assessment standpoint. And then finally here on the right-hand side, think of this as just utilization, whether that be from CPU, whether that be memory, heat maps that kind of just show you like, hey, is this something that's just running hot all the time? You get that level of information here. Once you have this, now you can actually start planning for, okay, I have a kind of an idea of how I want to do things. Now, maybe I want to look at this in different scenarios. And so this cloud mapping per host here is where we can do scenarios such as like a lift and shift. So this is a literal lift and shift of, I'm going to match my resources that I'm using today in my whole entire environment. And I'm going to move it into this EMR environment. And so it's going to give you the recommendations on the instances that you use that's going to match your hardware environment today. Down here, you can see exactly a little bit more analysis on the host level, but we get that level of detail. But up here, you can actually see what the costs are, right? So if we do this true literal lift and shift, maybe this is phase one. I need to get everything to the cloud, and then I will go ahead and figure out what my different services that I'll use. okay, well then here's a price that based on how things are based on the region, the service that you're running, we're able to give you that cost. And by the way, this is a pre-run report, but we do support all the major cloud providers. So whether this be Amazon, whether this be Azure, whether this even be Google, we can provide that same analysis for your particular workloads. For folks that actually want to get recommendations based on actual usage. So I don't know if you, on the cluster discovery report there before, we were averaging 17, 18% of resources consumption on this particular cluster. Now, if I actually want to look at this from an actual usage perspective, you can see down here, for example, on this particular environment, I'm actually just using 16 gigs. The current environment, I had 32 gigs. And so you're going to actually see recommendations that are based on actual usage. And so instead of me trying to match what I have on-prem today, what if I do a lift and shift model, but I want to actually match it on my actual usage? And so you can actually see here the recommendations that we provide here. But then you can also see that from that $440 price range here, we can actually drop down to $139. So definitely a lot more reasonable than $400 an hour. $139 an hour is something that's a little bit more easily, consumable if I'm being cost conscious. And so we have that scenario. One more scenario that I'll show you here from a planning perspective is we do have a workload fit report. And so think of this as giving me scenario-based where it's like, hey, maybe I don't want to do a whole lift and shift in my own type of environment. Maybe I'm just interested in maybe my Spark workloads. And I can go ahead and generate a heat map here to get a good understanding of the resource consumption on this particular slice. So, maybe I might want to move my batch workloads into another type of environment. Maybe I want to split this by department, or by priority, or however you want to split it. You can go ahead and select here. And then you make your selection up here in this step 1. Once you make that selection, you scroll over here to step 2. And this is where we start providing insights into like, hey, here's some recommendations and the actual cost if you were to actually just take my Spark workloads in this particular environment. And so I ran this report previously. So I selected some of these pre-selected variables in terms of, I want this to be Amazon EMR in my US West region. What is that going to be? On the right-hand side here, again, here's where that intelligence comes in, where we're going to look at things and we're actually going to say, hey, 100%, this is production, mission-critical workloads, cannot miss their SLAs. What's your recommendation for those workloads? Well, we have them here. So you guys can read this, but we give you that, the recommendation on the instances and what that cost may be. But for folks that maybe say, hey, you know what, this is my non-prod environment, my scratch development environment. Hey, I'm okay if 20% of the applications that get submitted here, how would I, what would those recommendations be? And I would get that here as well. And you can also see a cost saving associated with that as well. And so being able to have intelligence built in to just proactively just forecast what those costs may be. And not only that, but give you recommendations on what you should take so you can actually be cost effective, even if you're trying to match 100% of your workloads. That becomes very, very useful. For folks that may be running like long running clusters, right? Maybe this is an ephemeral and it just needs to continuously be running. We'll also provide recommendations on like an auto scale. So think of like your EMR workloads or maybe like your HD Insight workloads. If I want to leverage auto scaling or even Databricks, if it's a very long running interactive cluster, what could be a schedule that I can follow? And so in this particular instance, we make this schedule suggestion, and on that you can save up to 25% of whatever the cost may be, just by leveraging autoscale. And so again, this becomes very useful for really just that assess and plan stage to really understand where things stand from a migration standpoint. The next step is I need to do the migration itself, right? And so that's where just the bread and butter of Unravel comes in, where we're able to provide that APM. Now, we understand things such as, the applications itself. I'll just do one example here on the data side. And so here we're categorizing all the tables that you have from within your environment. We can set things up for hot, warm, and cold. So a lot of customers, especially cloud customers, they may want to move things. Hot would be obviously the most expensive data storage in your selected cloud environment, or maybe cold might be like the AWS Glacier type of service where it's like, I may use it every once in a while, but you can actually bring this for a cheaper storage model. And that comes right out from the environment itself. And the way we do that is we are looking at all the tables, we are looking at the queries, we even have the relationship of the application. So we can see how many Spark jobs or Hive jobs had hit this particular table. When was it last accessed, created, the size, et cetera, and so forth. If I drill in on one particular table here, I can even get down to the application level. What are the applications that are actually hitting this particular table? And really the picture I'm trying to paint here, guys, is think of us as a glorified data cube if you come from like an analysis model world, where it's like, if I want to slice and dice this by what are the type of resources needed on the workspace level, on the data pipeline level, on a table level, on however you want to slice and dice it. Maybe it's a tenant level. I want to bring in my finance, all of them part and parcel. What's involved? What are the relationships? What's the size? What's the resource consumption? All of that information is here, all related in a way, so that way there's not going to be missed. When I was talking about the whole miss complexity, you're not going to miss complexity here because we have all the relationships and all the metadata that's associated with it. So you have that full picture to do that implementation. And we're working with customers where they've forecasted their migration efforts to be 2 to 3 years, and now we're bringing that down to less than a year. Because we're leading all our decisions made by actual data usage. And so this is really talking about that third section here in terms of helping them on the migration side. Now let's talk about optimize and scale. And so from within Unravel itself, we are going in down to that application level, down to that data pipeline level, and really showing you, hey, this is what it runs in the old environment versus what it runs in my new cloud environment. Here are some recommendations to limit the amount of resources. So in this particular case, a Spark job, we can actually use, instead of 5 gig executors for this one that's submitted 5 executors, we can actually do it with 1 gig, right? That equates to smaller EMR instances, smaller Databricks instances. That stuff adds up over time. And being able to be being resourceful for the applications that you're submitted, so you're not just wasting cluster resources, is something where we can not only help make sure that you're hitting your ROI objectives, but from a performance perspective, what can we do to make sure that your new architecture is actually being performant with recommendations that are specific for the cloud environment that you're in? Now we're talking about that whole validate and manage and optimize piece, where let's do this with less amount of money, less amount of resources, but then at the same time, leading this with the recommendations, so that way we're able to hit, the SLAs that we're expecting, is generally high level how we help customers throughout their whole lifecycle journey from within their cloud migration journey. So to recap, guys, here, there's a couple of things that some pitfalls that you generally can run into from within your cloud migration project. I mean, these things can cost upwards to millions of dollars. So there's a lot of things riding to make sure that you're successful. And if you, kind of take heed of some of the things that I've seen customers and what has made their your cloud migration big data projects fail, if you can be cognizant of what those are and try to avoid that, but most importantly, really have a data-driven approach every step of the way, is really what's going to guarantee your success from a big data cloud migration project. And Unravel as that tool can give you that data-driven approach every step of the way. All right, that said, I'll kick it back to you, Kwok, if there's any questions for me.
Yeah, so thank you very much for that. So we do have questions. One direct question from someone from the audience based in Washington. What cloud vendors do we currently support? Can you tell us a bit more about the types of public cloud vendors?
So right now, we support the 3 major vendors, at least from a US perspective. So So AWS, Azure, and Google. We do have customers that are actively using us as a migration standpoint across all three major cloud vendors. And so hopefully that aligns with what you're with the selections that you are selecting.
Yeah, another question around hybrid models. So could you tell us a bit about customers' approach with hybrid? Like, are they integrating the hybrid approach to kind of take baby steps of moving specific sensitive data in the cloud? Could you tell us a bit more about what you've seen, your experiences in the market so far?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's a loaded question based on, definitely, lots of different requirements, but high level, you're going to see, and this may change over the years, but what you're going to see is you're going to have a lot of folks that there will always be a use case to have data on-prem. And so hybrid is a popular choice, and there's nothing wrong with hybrid as long as you're doing it right, and being cost conscious and performant and all that good stuff. That said, we can help with that, right? A lot of customers that we're working with, maybe they have such stringent data requirements that it just doesn't make sense to move to the cloud. Well, okay, understanding which data sets where that actually applies to, but then identifying the ones that can actually move to a cloud type of environment is something that we can help with. The other thing where we can help is just identifying, like, hey, there's times where, hey, we run our reports and it looks like you're maximizing, and you're getting the maximum ROI from your on-prem environment. So maybe it doesn't make sense to move to the cloud. I mean, those are the type of insights that, we're not going to, we do have an intelligence engine, but we're not going to tell you exactly what you need to do because there's always business requirements behind it. But whatever you want to choose, whether that be hybrid, whether that be all in on the cloud, whether it be a phased approach where it's like phase one, maybe 50% of my applications, and how do I actually support both my on-prem and my cloud. Those are the things that fall right in our wheelhouse, and that we're happy to help you if you're interested in working with us.
Yeah, I mean, talk a bit about kind of getting the model right. Have you noticed organizations looking at multi-cloud vendors or working on multi-cloud models at the moment with their big data?
100%. And again, it's usually like industry specific. Like I've seen customers where they can't store their data in one cloud vendor because that one cloud vendor they consider a competition, right? And so being able to understand, hey, what are the pros and cons if I were to do the same workload in a Google environment versus like a Microsoft environment? What are my cost implications? How is this going to perform? I mean, that going back to that whole, what if analysis, the whole total cost of ownership, you want to make sure that you're selecting not only, from a cost perspective, but hey, maybe, Dataproc and Google is going to give me a lot more value, it's going to be a lot more performant than what I'm doing, that I can do like on Amazon EMR, which by the way, I'm just using this as an example of vendor folks. I didn't do any, research on this, but yeah, I mean, it's really like, to answer that, you need data points. You need analysis that's going to forecast like what this could potentially be in terms of performance and cost. And that's exactly what we do. So if you're in that model of trying to understand, hey, I don't really know, I'm in that assessment phase of like, should I be multi-cloud? Should I be one cloud? What are the advantages, pros and cons? That's exactly, in our wheelhouse, and that's where we want to help you.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen so you alluded to organizations really looking at exploring the movement to the cloud. Have you seen organizations saying, look, our on-prem is still working, we're still going to invest in that environment, regardless of this transition or if this trend going on in the market? So you tell a bit more about some of the things you've seen, with corporate pressure saying, hey, we got a cloud strategy versus some of the big data teams saying, look, this work, and so on.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen customers that are just not going to move to the cloud for various reasons. I mean, I won't go into detail, but like there is valid reasons why you would not want to move to the cloud. Actually, I can give some examples. Like, big organizations, huge organizations, they've done their research, and based on the workloads, based on, the locality of things where they need to be, on-prem ends up actually, being more, a better, option for these guys. But there always is, advantages to the cloud that you just don't get on-prem, and that's a whole separate conversation. But it really depends on like what your drivers are. I think, kind of going back to what Unravel does as a tool is like really understanding like, hey, what's my cost if I'm doing this from within, if I kept everything on-prem? What is this if I move this to like a multi-tiered service architecture, like an AWS and Azure? What is that going to cost me? That's really going to be the thing that's going to ultimately guide you. And, like most other folks that are in the position to make these kind of decisions, the worst thing that you can do is just hope that you made the right decision.
Yeah.
And so again, I keep on beating this like a dead bush, but it really is a huge value prop for us. It's just understanding things from a data-driven approach is really what differentiates us, and why a lot of the cloud vendors really want to work with us. A lot of the SIs want to work with us because everything's kind of manual for the most part for them. And if we have an automated data-driven approach, that's always going to give you better outcomes in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely, and definitely de-risking the kind of the risk factor, right, of moving to the cloud, providing all of the insights and so on.
Exactly. I can't believe I didn't use that word de-risk, but yes, if you were to look at everything in general, it all falls into de-risking, the decisions that you're making, which are huge decisions. Moving to the cloud is not a cheap endeavor, and so whatever you can do to de-risk that, is always going to be to your advantage.
Yeah. So as we wrap up, I see there's no more questions left. Can you give the audiences that are listening today perhaps top three? What are your top three considerations that they need to come straight to the head when you're moving to the cloud, or when you're like, okay, we need to start planning for this? Like, what are the top three things that they need to consider?
Sure. So I think first is just understanding your motives for the cloud. You shouldn't be moving to the cloud because everybody else is doing it. And so is that use case that you're trying to do, are there advantages of moving to the cloud? So that's something that you gotta figure out. When moving to the cloud, like what is your approach? Are you going to be more like a modern data architecture where we're going to use some of like all the new guys, like the Databricks of the world, the Snowflakes of the world? How is that all going to interact together? How is this going to actually add value to your organization is something to keep in mind. And then finally, hey, if I feel like a lot of folks move to the cloud right now is because of cost. And yes, there's definitely some cost cutting features, and we talked about it earlier. As long as you're taking advantage of like the cloud native features that promote cost optimization, is something that you want to be mindful of. But it's the performance factor that bites people in the long run, where they ultimately, hey, it might be a little bit cheaper, but like my applications are just, I can't rely on them to hit my SLA, and they're always failing, et cetera, and so forth. Keep that in mind, because it's not always just about cost. It's also about like, hey, it's a new environment, different problems, you have to solve for that. And if there was a tool out there that can kind of, really proactively show you, where those bottlenecks are in the new environment, that exists, and that's Unravel, that's going to be a good, tool to have in your arsenal.
Fantastic. I think that's all the time we have today for this webinar. Just a reminder for the audience that this webinar is available instantly on demand. So feel free to share this with your colleagues and your peers and whoever you find relevant by the same link. If you are watching on demand and would like to ask a question, feel free to email us at hello@unraveldata.com or chris@unraveldata.com. You shared your email address earlier on in the slide. Let us know what you think by rating this session. Give it a thumbs up or thumbs down. Give us some feedback, or let us know if there's some topics that you'd like to hear about. On behalf of Unravel, thank you very much, Chris, for sharing your knowledge today, and thank you for your time, and thank you to the audiences who spent a good chunk of 50 minutes listening to you today. And we hope
sticking with me this whole time.
Well, yeah, I mean, hopefully we can de-risk some of your cloud migration strategies, well, cloud migration programs, right? So thank you very much. We hope to see you in a future webinar, and have a great rest of the week. Cheers. Thanks.
Thanks, folks.
Bye.